we've kind of got two parts to this presentation. One is the first part of this title here, 20 Years of Applied Forest Ecology Research with J.D. Irving Ltd. But the major themes have been biodiversity, natural disturbance, and forest management. And I've got a lot of co-investigators and grad students, and I'll list everybody at the end. But all the speakers in this session are involved in a current project that we've got. So my objectives here are to describe what's called the J.D. Irving Ltd. Forest Research Advisory Committee, what's its mandate and function, and how and why does it work. And then I want to talk about our last 5-year project with 26 investigators. It's called Landscape Level Effects of Intensive Forest Management on Biodiversity. And the graphic on the left of the screen here is a layout of not our current project, but the one before that, where there were 6 25-hectare blocks that went through alternative thinning regimes and looked at the effects on small mammals and on bryophytes and on ground vegetation and on insects, etc., through a permanent sample plot network. Let's see. So this Forest Research Advisory Committee was established kind of over 20 years ago now as a product of an initial FSC certification audits by the company. And it was made up of experts in ecological fields plus company managers, originally led by Gordon Baskerville. And initially it set aside some benchmark and some adaptive management reserves on privately owned land for research. And the mandate was to identify or advocate research to help company managers solve problems in their forests. It was initially focused on research to address knowledge gaps with respect to non-timber biodiversity values and natural disturbances. And kind of the mantra of the committee was to empower the forest manager as a decision maker with ecological information. And I think it's been an active partnership of researchers and forest managers with regular two-way communication and two-way education. The key elements have been that the managers have been involved in project selection and design and proposal creation. So there's been company buy-in and vested interest from the outset. The committee as a whole monitors and evaluates research project progress with regular grad student updates to the Research Advisory Committee. And there's been funding leverage. The company's been put cash on the line for this, but we've looked for ways to multiply it. But it requires significant commitment of time from company staff for research involvement and efforts. In the initial years, we were linked with the Sustainable Forest Management Network, a network center of excellence led by University of Alberta. And I've just got 7 examples of completed grad student projects here, just to give you a flavor of some of the topics. So species composition of mixed wood stands kind of over a 60-year period from the 1940s to 2008, effects of spruce budworm outbreaks on stand dynamics of balsam fir and red spruce shade-tolerant mixed woods, natural regeneration in tolerant hardwoods and mixed woods after partial cutting, pre-commercial thinning effects on herbaceous plants, forest bryophytes, and small mammals, influence of stand and landscape structure on American marten and northern flying squirrel, ovenbird and brown creeper responses to selection, harvesting, and forest zoning scenario effects on landscape structure and yields. Jason Killam will talk more about this in the final presentation of the session, but how J.D. Irving uses new knowledge kind of after the first 10 years. And we put together a report on this. And the knowledge gained from the cooperative research has been used to trigger analysis to quantify the baseline situation on the land base and or forecast future forest conditions to compare with proposed targets. To initiate a review of how Irving inventories certain habitat features and stratifies the forest inventory, to formulate new management strategies, objectives, targets, and measures, to formulate best management practices for implementation in the field, to design new research questions, and to identify issues as new significant environmental impacts in the Irving environmental management system. My graphic on the second slide there was about this project from 2010 to 2015, alternative commercial thinning of spruce plantations. So there was an unthinned control, status quo commercial thinning, experimental biomass removal where branches and tops were removed for biomass use, and an enhanced structure of unthinned clumps and girdling to create deadwood within plantations. And kind of overlaid on this were 6 graduate student projects at University of New Brunswick and University of Moncton, looking at effects on stand growth, light, and photosynthesis on small mammals, mosses and ground vegetation, birds, saprophytic beetles, and effects of deadwood. So switching over to the topic of our session today, landscape levels effects of intensive forest management on biodiversity. Why is the company interested in this? Managed forests are an important contributor to economic and non-timber values. The ecological contributions of managed, including planted forests, to biodiversity objectives at the landscape scale need to be better understood. And Irving has a long history of forest management with plantation establishment dating back to 1957. So it places a high priority on addressing this issue. The Black Brook District in northern New Brunswick is privately owned by the company, about 200,000 hectares in area. And it's been the test land base for much of this area. It's a mix of shade-tolerant hardwood, mixed wood, softwood stands, and plantations. The project proposal was generated in collaboration with the Irving Forest Research Advisory Committee. And the idea was the involvement of the company managers in all phases of the study, sort of to ensure prompt incorporation of learning and knowledge into management. Irving set several land manager objectives at the outset to essentially define areas of study. So they wanted to be able to maintain availability and quality of water and aquatic habitat, to establish strategies to maintain biologically appropriate deer, moose, and bear populations while supporting recreational hunting opportunities, essentially a social objective there. Ensure that management is not compromising viability of avian species of concern. Several specific bird species were identified. Ensure that management is not endangering listed species of concern. Maintain viable populations of species associated with old forest conditions. And to develop improved management and mitigation measures if it's been demonstrated that they're failing to achieve the above objectives or indicators are lagging behind those under less intensive management strategies. So the project research questions were, how can wall-to-wall high-intensity LiDAR and other forest site data to be used to identify priority habitat and management sensitive areas in forest landscapes? How will forest composition and structure vary over the next 50 years under Irving's planned management and natural disturbances that will occur? What are the projected effects on habitat? How do forest composition, structure, and habitat differ between current and projected Black Brook District compared to less intensive managed and reserve areas? And how can we best use technology and data to monitor selected taxa and link taxa responses to landscape level changes? What is the status of priority taxa in the district compared to less intensively managed and unmanaged reserves? And then finally, to conduct some spatial analysis, projections of future forest composition, structure, and habitat. Will the district provide sufficient habitat in the future for selected wildlife species? If not, what mitigation should be considered? So in conclusion, the Forest Research Advisory Committee has continued for 24 years now. Irving is committed to fund another 5-year project that we're looking at defining right now. The current landscape project overall intent is to compare intensive versus less intensive versus unmanaged, project landscape conditions, compare the past versus current versus future, interpret habitat, monitor selected taxa, and develop mitigation strategies if required. But the focus is on landscape level habitat availability. From the logos on the right here, there are a number of different universities involved, kind of not just in New Brunswick, but in Quebec and in Ontario as well. There are a large number of co-investigators, collaborators, and grad students. So the bold names on my slide here are the presenters in the remainder of this session, where we'll talk about birds and water, beetles and bryophytes, and projecting the forest forward, and then finally hear from the company on how they see things going forward.
So what I want to talk about, as Barry pointed out, we're looking at a lot of different groups, taxonomic groups within the context of this project and this work, and I think that's really important. My piece of this was looking at birds. Oh, my slides are moving on their own. Was to look at the birds, and there's a good reason for that for me. I work on a lot of different taxa, but birds is one that I like for some I think some pretty good reasons. One is that I think that birds provide some of the best faunal biodiversity data we have over large areas. So because we have, you know, sorry about that, my slides are switching on their own here. I don't know how to make that stop. There's a lot of citizen science associated with bird data collection, because there's such a public profile for birds. And as you know, we saw in Matt Betts's talk on Monday, this data can be used for looking at really broad scale and long-term questions about how forest management and other things are affecting faunal biodiversity. Over, you know, like as I said, over large scales and long term. So the breeding bird survey data is has been going on since the early 60s. So there's you know, 60 years of data there. And the other thing, though, that kind of data provides is context for questions at smaller scales. And what we're interested here in this project in particular is the Blackbrook land base. But I think you can think about this more in terms of forest management companies need to be able to make decisions. They do the forest management there. That's the level at which forest management decisions get made. And so they need to understand how their landscapes compare to the broader context that they're working in. And that's an important piece of information for companies, and it's also an important information at a broader land use planning scale. For birds, obviously, there's really standard and efficient data collection methods, and that means that there's a lot of data. So people have been working on birds for a long time, and point counts, we know a lot about what the nature of the data that comes out of point counts, and that really helps with analyses. And now we have autonomous recording units, so these things are waterproof and programmable, and so it's allowed for a huge influx of data collection. And as well, it allows non-experts to collect data. So companies can invest in these units and monitor their own data on their land bases. These recording units collect audio data that can then be interpreted by birders, and in some cases, and it's getting better every day, by basically using machine learning techniques. Also, birds are really good integrators of the forest ecosystem. So in terms of structure, function, and composition, they tell us a lot about the forest, and they can tell us a lot about forest integrity. And that's really the driver for me, is what can birds tell us about forest integrity? And then as well, and other species on the land base, and as well, we have really good life history information for birds. And the reason that that's important is because when we start to see changes, differences in bird communities in one place versus another, we have some ecological insight into why those changes might be happening. Sometimes we work on species groups that we don't know enough about the life history to fully understand. We can see change, but we can't understand sort of the underlying ecological mechanisms that are driving that change. So that's something that's really important for birds. So the question that I am most interested in is what the birds can tell us about the effectiveness of our forest management practices. And this, like I say, this is not about bird conservation per se. This is about birds as indicators of a broader forest ecological integrity. And for me, that idea of effectiveness is the idea about measuring the difference or the gap between what we have, and what we have is a reflection of historical and current practices on the land, forest management practices, and what we want. And what we want is not an easy question, and that it came up in the session earlier this morning in natural disturbance emulation. It's not a slam dunk that we know what it is we actually want out of our land base, and that is a social question. But I hope that science can help inform it. One of the things that gets discussed a lot is this idea of reference condition, that we have unmanaged forests that can act as points of comparison for what we're doing on the managed land base. And again, this was a big discussion in the emulating natural disturbance session. There are reasons why that is a really problematic idea. And the first one is obviously climate change. We have a moving target here. The unmanaged forest is not consistently the same over time, and so it's hard to know what we're aiming for. The second thing is that at a landscape scale, we have really limited comparable unmanaged forests at these larger scales. We have it at stand scales, but at larger scales, there's often no comparable landscapes or inaccessible comparable landscapes because there are no roads, for example. So that's really key, that we don't necessarily have a good point of comparison for these things. And the last thing is that harvest is often additive to the natural disturbance. And so if your starting point is you want your land base to be exactly the same as unmanaged forest, I think you're gonna be pooched right from the beginning. So I think this is a really important thing to think about. Is yes, we can use ecological forestry and natural disturbance emulation as a model, but it's probably not the best target for what we're aiming for when we're looking at effectiveness. So I just want to describe very briefly a study that we've done in the context of this FRAC project. So it's a landscape comparison. We have 3 landscapes, and what we were aiming for here is a gradient in management intensity. So I'll admit up front, we had a really hard time getting the numbers for the Du Bois landscape in Maine, and so I don't have them here. We know that the Blackbrook has about 40% area planted, and we know that the Quizibus landscape, which is so the Blackbrook is a privately managed landscape, as Dave has already mentioned. Quizibus is a provincially managed landscape, and it has about 10% area planted and quite a bit less area thinned. And then there's the Du Bois landscape, where we anticipate that there's a lot less plantation there, but I don't have the numbers for you right now. But the idea here is that we have a gradient in management intensity at the landscape scale. And what we did was we grouped the birds based on, as I was talking about that life history information, we grouped the birds based on functional traits that we anticipated would be strongly influenced by management intensity at the landscape scale. Now I'm going to point, we only measured birds in mature stands. So this is truly a measure of the effect of the landscape at on the local scale. But we looked at 4 elements that we anticipate, or 4 functional trait groups that we figured were going to be impacted by managed landscape level management intensity. The first is cavity nesters, where we anticipated fewer cavities, and that's in the top left. And you can see the BBRO Blackbrook, Quizibus, QUIS, and Du Bois, DEBU. So you can see that purple, the purple bar in that graph is showing that there's not obviously differences in the total number of cavity nesters in these 3 landscapes in mature habitats. The top right is cereal stage, and the MO, the green at the top, is mature overmature. So these are mature overmature bird associates, and their abundance is relatively similar in all 3 landscapes. We looked at area sensitivity, where we would expect that species that are area sensitive would be less common in highly intensively managed landscapes. We didn't see that here. And then we looked at habitat use in terms of interior versus edge species, and you can see the interior, which is sort of the darker green, is not showing obvious effects based on landscape level management. We didn't have an unmanaged land base that was really comparable that we could include in this study. But when we look at it from this perspective, it does not appear that the high level intensity in the Blackbrook forest is compromising the ability of the old forest in those stands to provide habitat for old forest associates. Not a perfect test for sure, and this is I think typical of this kind of work is it's very difficult to find the perfect test for this kind of question. to get at the, so that tells you something about old forest and landscape level effects, but really what you probably want to know is how much, what's the sort of ecological value of that land base to provide habitat for birds, for the birds that you're most interested in. And so in order to do that, we collected 450 points over the whole of the Black Brook Forest, stratified by into 17 different cereal stage, tree composition and management style categories. And this is what we're trying to do. And I fully admit we are not there quite there yet. We used automated recording to develop, to generate bird occupancy data. We're developing occupancy models with the environmental data, specifically the environmental data that we have spatial estimates for. And then we're creating maps of probability of occurrence. Thomas, at near the end of this session, is going to talk about landscape level projections through time under alternative management scenarios and climate change. So we're going to link those with our bird habitat models and generate projections of bird habitat into the future under alternative management scenarios. This is another way around this reference condition problem, in that we can rank the approaches, or rank the scenarios according to their ability to provide habitat for species. Now this could be construed as a single species approach, but what we can do is develop indices based on those life history traits, again, to look at groups of species that are expected to be impacted over the long term potentially by something like truncation of age class distribution. So we're able to use the life history data again to create what we think will be indices that should be sensitive to long-term changes in the landscape in the direction that we are in the direction where we expect there to be stressors. Ultimately, where we want to go, and Elliot McIntyre is going to talk about this in his keynote today, this afternoon, is to take models like that of birds and link them to models of all of the other features on the land base that we're interested in, whether it's timber supply or beetles or carbon or whatever you want, really, and provide an integrated model where you can look at the trade-offs between different values. And that's going to be where you're going to provide the information that you need to make the decisions about forest management. That process, and it's interesting because I haven't heard Dave say that line before. Barry Cook brought it up in the last session. Dave McLean says we need tools. This is the kind of tool that we need to inform the process of thinking about what we want our future landscapes to look like and what the trade-offs are going to be when we do that. And that's essential, because otherwise we're really operating blind. That process needs science, and science needs to inform the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Okay, as part of the project, the research grant that was presented earlier by Dave McLean, my piece of the project was to look at the phyte dispersing beetle as model organisms of what is happening, in fact, in terms of biodiversity in the landscape, based on the consideration that beetles are currently the most diverse group of terrestrial organisms, especially in forest habitats, that they fulfill different ecological role in our forest, acting as decomposers of woody and animal necromass, as prey for many different organisms, as pollinator, and as predators, for example, of a few of the trophic roles you're going to find in this group. Thus, there's studies allowing us to learn about a series of different essential ecosystem functions. So our part of the research project was directly linked to the land manager objective to maintain viable population of species, especially those associated with old forest conditions. And our specific objective with the study of beetle was to compare phyte dispersing beetle community in all natural and managed forest and in plantation, to determine how these communities were evolving with time in managed areas. So the hypothesis of our work for this initial part of the project was to, based on the idea that if plant succession is convergent over time in naturally regenerated stands and in plantation, then also what we should expect to find is due to the deterministic mechanism of succession, eventually the beetles community should also converge with time. So we started with this part of the project. I'm going to switch to the other part eventually, to the modeling. But what basically we saw, this is some general result, is that indeed forests tend to, as they get older, they tend to converge in terms of how they look like, the amount of dead wood that is getting accumulated, that's accumulating. The major difference between the two being that total tree density is higher in naturally regenerated stands than in plantation. Now, when we look at the beetle community, we get a different, well, something similar. In fact, at the beginning, the communities of beetles in young plantation and in young second growth stands are highly different. But as the stands are getting older, we see that there's initially a little bit of convergence, and then with time, old second growth stands and old plantation basically harbor the same communities of beetles. And those communities are also highly similar to what you'll find in conservation areas. So the take-home message from this part of the work was that there's convergence in forest succession, either if the forest is either from a plantation or a second growth stand. In term here, we're talking about coniferous second growth stands, but and eventually they converge both in terms of what the forest looks like in terms of attribute, and also what are the beetle communities that you'll find in those forests. And the only point here, the only issue is that you see that the initial seral stage in plantation is supporting communities that are highly different from what you'll see in young second growth. So maybe there's concerns about the conservation of early successional communities of beetles in intensively managed forest landscape. But following this project, we realized we had an extensive data set on flight dispersing forest beetles. And so the question became, can we project those organisms now, especially some of the matrix of the community, for example, the richness and the abundance, but at the landscape scale. I'm going to go through the methods to explain you how we did that, or we try to do that, in fact. So initially in the project, we identified 17 different seral stages over the Black Brook district landscape. So just if you were not there when Dave was talking, Black Brook is about 190,000 hectares. So it's a major chunk of the province of New Brunswick. And those 17 seral stages are repeating themselves. So we've selected a series of each. And in them, we placed the flight intercept traps to collect beetles. So this is what a flight intercept trap looks like. They're made of acrylic sheets. They're about 1 feet wide and 2 feet long. They're crossed. And at the bottom of the trap, you have a styrene funnel that is leading whatever is going to fall in there into a cup where there's a mix of alcohol, a little bit of soap to break the water, the surface tension. And the way this is working is when an insect is flying in and hits the trap, most of the insect will just fly up. But beetles do differently. They'll have a tendency to fall down, so they'll end up in the collection cup. So we're getting a nice sample of beetles, and the way we place the traps, we place usually 3 traps per stand at minimum. These traps are at least 30 meters from each other and at least 30 meters away from edges, because we've learned in a previous CRD project that This is the distance where there's an edge effect. Even if it's a continuous edge, there's still going to be some differences in that first 30 meters. So once you pass that, you tend to have communities that are a lot more stable. So we had 3 traps. Around each trap, we also sampled for the attribute, and both in terms of the forest, but also the dead wood that was available. We went down to 2 centimeter in diameter pieces. We also had a lot of data from either the enhanced forest inventory from LiDAR and also from a precision forest inventory that was the company developed. And for the insects that we gather in our traps, because we're sampling during the summer from the early June to the end of August, we brought back those samples. They were pinned. They were identified to the highest taxonomic level. You'll see that most of them were identified to the species level. So what do we do with this now? We have a major data set in terms of what are the attributes of the forest, over 125 columns of data using those 2 inventories. So how do we decide which variable is important and which one is not? In our case, we decided to use random forest, which is a machine learning technique. We split our data set into a training data set comprising about 80% of the data, and then the rest was a cross-validation data set to test if our random forests were any good. We use correlation to link them at the beginning, and finally standardize major axis regression, which are type 2 regressions. So here are some of the results. I'm not going to go through it because it's a crazy amount of data that we ended up collecting. About 50,000 beetles were collected in the 2 years that we sampled. We sampled again last summer, but this is not included here. They were identified at the highest taxonomic level, which means we ended up with 313 taxonomic units that were split mostly at the species level, some at the genus level, and finally very few at higher levels. The reason why some are not identified at species level is often because they require dissections, and this is we decided to stop already. It's a lot of information, and it's a very good data set to start with. This is the rank abundance curve for what we get. So it's just normal. We're getting a lot of species that are fairly abundant, and eventually many species that are they're seen once or twice. So this is just an idea. This is the species list. It's just to show off a bit with all the species, the number that were gathered. You see there's a lot of differences. Some species are collected very rarely, others are collected a lot, which is, again, normal considering the work we're doing. So when we look at beetle richness, what do we obtain according to the seral stages? So you see there's a lot of variability in terms of what we got. So each point here represents all the beetles collected in a trap in a year. So you see that for some stands, for example, in the middle, some have very low densities, very low richness all the time. And by contrast, some other stands are usually you get nice richness that is pretty consistent from time to time. So this type of data is surprisingly even normal. So I guess it's easier to model. And effectively, when we ran our random forest, the model converged rapidly, identified a series of important variables to explain diversity. In this case, richness. I just highlighted here some of the most important one. You can see that there's a lot. Some are from the LiDAR inventory. Some are from the precision forest inventory. And when we look at if the model is performing good, you have the training data set in white here and the cross-validation data set in black, and you can see there's a nice relationship between the richness that we measured and the expected richness from the model. So with this model, we basically modeled the whole thing. You have again here the beetle species richness, which is versus the prediction for all the points, including both the training and the cross-validation data set. And we have a fairly decent R-square of 0.63, which shows that the model is pretty good at predicting diversity. Now, what's happening when you extend that at the landscape scale with the same variables? Well, this is our first map, was just finished this weekend, of beetle richness according to where we are on the Black Brook district. So you see some areas with the dark blue where there's low diversity that is expected, and some area on both the east and the west side of the district where we're observing a lot higher richness. If we do the same exercise for beetle abundance, it's more difficult to predict. There's a lot of variability in abundance, even within a given zero stage. But again, the model converged rapidly. We're able to identify a series of variables that are important to predict beetle abundance. We ended up with a training data set or cross-validation data set, both being showing up a nice trend. And when we did prediction using type 2 regression, try to link beetle abundance and the random forest prediction, we're again very surprised having a R-square of 0.60. So with this model, we basically again projected the results of the model to the at the district scale. And again, in the center, we see some area with dark blue with lower abundance that is expected. And on the edges of the district, that's where we're finding higher abundance, beetle abundance in this case. So what is interesting is when we put all of this together and compare that to what we see at the landscape scale, what are the major forest types? And you can see there's a trend already starting to come out, which the softwood area, which are mainly planted in the center, are having a lower abundance and lower diversity. The non-forest area, that's where you're going to get the lowest, in fact, both richness and abundance. And in the tolerant hardwood areas, we're obtaining usually higher richness, higher abundance. But nevertheless, you can see that there's pocket of high diversity, both richness and abundance, a little bit everywhere on the landscape, according to the model. So there's a potential for sourcing effect within those beetle communities. So just some quick point, we're kind of happy we succeeded in mapping the invisible biodiversity of forest arthropods, because this is rarely done. Most of the time, we model species, especially vertebrate species. So having a little bit of an idea of what's happening with the diversity of arthropods is kind of significant, we think. But this is just the first step. Now we've tried to model individual species. It didn't work as well, because often in invertebrates you have several species filling for the same role. So it's not necessarily easy. It's easier to model the assemblages. So we'll maybe try the next step. One of the next step would be to model the guild to see if the ecosystem functions or maintained at the landscape scale, and to project the models in the future according to different scenarios, including global warming and so on. And another thing we're working on right now is trying to see if we can do it at the whole scale of the province. And we're not just working from data collected in Black Brook, but also from data collected all over New Brunswick. So there's a lot of people I'd like to thank, and thank you for listening.
Because I don't have a camera on that computer, I've provided to you a picture of myself. So you'll have to remember my face for the rest of the presentation. As Dave mentioned it, I'm talking about bryophyte. I was in charge of the bryophyte aspect of this project. Okay. So I go directly to the introduction because I don't think it's necessary to explain why it is important to study bryophytes, because all groups of living things are important to study, and especially in that context of management, to see how it affects them and their biodiversity. So the objective in that research was to study the impacts of fragmentation on bryophyte diversity and distribution, and also to better understand the effects of management on bryophyte diversity and distribution at the landscape level, because we pretty well understand what other factors that affect bryophytes' biodiversity, especially in a managed context. The hypothesis for that research was that given the preservation of old stand characteristics through times and for all stand type in the controlled landscape, diversity will be higher and contains more rare species in the controlled landscape than in the managed one. And because younger and are more homogenized and has lower diversity, and therefore will provide less probable for the surrounding area, the percentage of young and managed stands will affect the diversity of stands that are surrounding them. So the study stands and landscape are just the same as we already saw. And from all of the categories that were available for that study, I only sampled in mature stands and old growth stands, because that's where you will find the best diversity for bryophyte. And also it wouldn't have been possible to sample in every stand type, because it takes so much time for identification, and it won't be worth it because diversity is known to be found in the mature stands. So we came out with a total of 7 stand type, with 4 to 6 replicates in Blackbrook and only 3 to 4 replicates in the control stand in the control landscape in Mount Cullerton, just because of time. I had less time for sampling and identification. So bryophyte were sampled on any substrate in a 1 meter wide transect crossing 400 meter square circular plots. And every plots were at a minimum of 80 meters from the edge, because we wanted to avoid the age effect, which is great for the bryophyte and already have been showed to have big effects on bryophyte diversity. So we wanted to avoid it, make sure we get most of the diversity that is contained within stand type. After that, with the ArcGIS program, I've made for each plot a 5 kilometer radius raster that was created to extract the landscape metrics that were, I choose metrics that were about similarity, proximity, connectivity, edge contrast, area perimeter, and also the percentage of young stand and plantation in that 5 kilometer radius raster. Also for the Mount Cullerton, I've made a buffer around the property of Mount Cullerton, because it's a lot more smaller than the Blackbrook district, and some of the plots didn't have a complete 5 kilometer radius raster. So I just took the data available and made a buffer around it and characterized all of the stand to get that raster. So there's first question was, are those two landscapes really comparable? So in some points, yes, and other points, no. In general, Mount Cullerton is a bit colder and precipitation is a bit higher. So the humidity is a bit higher, but also soil deposit is different. And that make kind of a big difference is because there's more calcareous and limestone soil in Blackbrook. So there's a lot more cedar stands present that are present in Blackbrook than it is in Mount Cullerton. And Mount Cullerton has a more Mount Cullerton has a less richer soil type, and there's no wonder why it became actually a provincial park, is because of it's not as productive as it is in the Black Brook district, the forest. And also the topography difference, because in Black Brook it's more like valleys with some deep valleys, and in Mount Carleton is a lot more mountainous, and so a lot more rocks there. And there's a lot more mature forest in Mount Carleton, and it's easy to understand because there haven't been any trees cut there since maybe 70 years old. So for the results, what we can see in those graphs is that actually those two landscapes are a lot comparable. Richness wasn't different between those two landscapes, but we also can see that the blue lines, which represent the Mount Carleton landscape, it did not reach an asymptote, because the dot line only represent extrapolated data, and the complete lines is the actual data. So actually there were fewer species in Mount Carleton, but if I had sampled more, it might have a higher richness, which I'm not sure about, because diversity in Black Brook is a lot driven by presence of cedar stands, and they're in the total property on the Mount Carleton, there's like maybe 5 cedar stands, so not a lot of cedar stands. So, well, I don't know, but still, those are two comparable landscape. And now, this is the same graphic, but now we can see for each of the stands. And what we can see is that on the bottom top and the bottom, it's the drier sides, and on the from the middle to the top is the more humid sides that are more similar. Overall richness is similar between stand, but diversity is different between plantation and control softwood, and all cedar stand and Black Brook mixed wood. Composition follows approximately the same pattern. So what we can see in that graph is that we have the mesic stands, which is the cedar and also the softwood stand, and the xeric stands at the right are the tolerant hardwood plantation. Mixed wood is in the middle, and it's all intermixed. So softwood stands in the Mount Carleton is at the same place than it is for Black Brook in that graph, except for the tolerant hardwood has a more richness than it has in the Black Brook district. It resembles a little bit more of what we will find in the mixed wood stands, either on Black Brook or on Mount Carleton. And we also can see on that, so I've added the matrix, landscape matrix in that graph, and we can see FRAC, PARA, and NLSE are all indices that are related with just the shape of the stand. And at the right, we can see that COMPI, CAE, or CONTIG are all, or even CORE, are all indices that are related with the area, the size of the stands we have. It's simply because tolerant hardwood and also plantation that is at the right, they are more square or rounded shape, and also they are all clumped together, so the aggregation level is higher. And for the mesic stands, it all is around the hydrologic systems. Yeah, so their shapes are more longer, and that's why there's more indices that are related with those stands. I didn't find any relation between matrix and pattern and matrix stand pattern and richness. As I said, more complex shape of stand are associated with higher diversity and mesic composition, and aggregation level is associated with xeric composition, so the plantation and tolerant hardwood. and I didn't see any impacts of the amount of young stand or the amount of plantation surrounding a stand. This means that actually Blackbrook is doing pretty well at keeping a great diversity of bryophyte, and this is mainly due to all of the area that have been protected. So the land, and also the thing is that those landscape metrics are not telling much about bryophyte distribution and diversity. They're telling us about the pattern of the management, the forest management of Blackbrook that accentuate the natural pattern of stand in that district. That is a lot. So this pattern is affected by the topographic characteristics, soil type, and also hydrologic network. Yeah. So also the stand area is an important feature at keeping a great diversity of bryophyte, because you can avoid the edge effect, but stand area won't have any effects on diversity if the stand keep being regenerated and simplified by tree removal. So if we keep going and as like in the tolerant outwood stand and remove trees and do whatever managements is now, we won't ever be able to have a great diversity in those stands, because in those stands the substrate that is most often encountered is dead wood. But if you remove woods from that stand, we won't ever have great diversity there. Reserve area and riparian buffer, they really helped Blackbrook to keep a great amount of diversity in just stand type, but as also bryophyte diversity. But all riparian zones are not equivalent and should not be seen as all effective at preserving bryophyte diversity because of their width, the tree composition, exposition also, and the topography. So the bigger the area it is, the better it is for a stand type. And just a comment that is not actually linked with landscape management, but it's about mature stand and how we perceive mature stands, is that they are not all equal because of what I said before about being regenerated or simplified with the removal of trees. So you can have, let's say, Nicara pennata, which is an indicator of old and mature forest, that will make people believe that they're considering as old, but they won't have the other characteristic that makes that on mature stands, like the amount of dead woods found on the soil. So we have to be careful with those stand quality indicators. And also limitation in further research. So a great question for me is, what is then the percentage of the landscape that should be protected to ensure that we have a great diversity of bryophyte through times? And also some limitation that might have affect the analysis is the available math information. So I had to deal with the how the forest had been mapped, and sometimes those are not the real data. They just are data that have been extrapolated from other means. The way also I choose to categorize every stand prior to the matrix extraction might add an effect, and also the methodology I'd use for stand contrast estimation. So I'd like to thank everyone who had helped me for that study.
I've changed my title as well. I think a better description is the influence of forest structure and post-harvest silviculture on freshwater ecosystems and managed forest landscapes. And basically the question we're trying to answer here is why is it that the measured effectiveness of management practices in terms of mitigating impacts on waters varies so much? We know that management best practices in forested landscapes have a long history of aiming to prevent impacts on water, and generally we think they do that effectively. But we do see in the literature that there's some cases where we see really minimal impacts and other cases where we see really large impacts, and we don't really know why that is, and there's probably a lot of reasons for that, but we're tackling some of that here in this study. Even Matene's work, for those of you who saw it, she did note that simply looking at the intensity of forest harvest was not a very good predictor of impacts on water. But that's because there's a whole lot of other things going on in these sites as well. So we're really emphasizing here the importance of the temporal context in these sites. And what I mean by that is that a managed forest is not just simply a place where, you know, there's some clear cut happening or some selection cut happening. There's a whole lot of things going on over decades. So this is a mapping of some of the activities going on in 3 watersheds that we were looking at, and I'll show you those watersheds in a second, but they're the same watersheds from the study that Matene presented as well. But basically, for example, there's sort of a history of clear-cut activities that ebbs and flows. There's planting that peaks in some cases where there's a lot of forest harvest activity. There's also a lot of road construction where there's where there's clear cut, you might also have planting, and not where there isn't clear cut, obviously. And so not only is there a really complex history, but there's a complexity of interaction and collinearity on the landscape. And we really have a lack of sort of long-term studies in these real complex landscapes that have this history. You know, it's also really important to have targeted studies like the Backy kind of designs that that are experimental to look at the impacts of just clear cut or just selection cut. It's really important to tease out those specific effects, but it's also really important to understand how all of these things interact and work together, and how the effects of each of these activities sort of compare to each other. But it does pose some problems, and that is one that I already pointed out, the collinearity of everything. So I've just kind of pointed out here that there's sort of a peak of both planting activity and clear cut activity in some of these sites at the same time. And then when we're working at watershed scales, it's also really hard to get to do this in a lot of sites. And the less sites you have, the more the collinearity issue becomes a problem. So we have to deal with all that, but we have to deal with that if we want to answer questions about why there's so much variation in the ability to detect responses, or rather, the variation in the effectiveness of management practices. So specifically, we're asking here a few questions. If you think back to the temporal context there, what we often see in literature is that people will just go in and accumulate all disturbances over, say, the 10 years prior to when they're taking measurements, or 5 years or 20 years or whatever. But we're curious whether that time you select to quantify management activities in the past matters when you're assessing impacts on stream ecosystems. We're also curious whether some of those other activities on the landscape, like post-harvest silviculture, planting, and so on, act to exacerbate some of the impacts we see on stream ecosystem functions and biodiversity, or whether they actually mitigate some of those effects. And thirdly, the other thing, when you think about the history of disturbances and forest management practices on the landscape, they're also just all shaping current forest structure. And current forest structure also has an impact on water quality. So we're also curious whether that current contemporary forest structure is a good predictor of stream ecosystem conditions as well. And so all of this is informing both approaches for research and managed watersheds, and then also management practices in general if we're considering impacts on water. So this is occurring, it's piggybacking on the same watersheds that Matene presented on in the other session on Tuesday. So these are 3 watersheds that give us a very nice, they're in 3 managed areas that are managed very differently. So they give us a nice contrast of A lot of sites in one of the watersheds that has far more natural regeneration, less intervention. The Black Brook the middle watershed there is in the Black Brook area, so there's a lot more post-harvest plantations, thinning and so on. And then the third watershed is the Charlotte watershed, and it's got far less overall harvest and far less pressure in general. And for this study, I'm just focusing on basically trying to detect whether any of these management practices what influence we see on ecosystem functions in streams. So to do that, I'm looking primarily at microbial community composition and functional response to water chemistry changes in response to these harvest activities and silvicultural activities, mostly because it's this base of the food web stuff that drives a lot of the ecosystem functions like nutrient cycling, carbon cycling, elemental and pollution cycling, and biomass production. So back to that collinearity issue before we move on. So I have to be kind of quick going through this statistical approach, but just to give you a sense of how we sort of worked with the collinearity in the data set. We use something called hierarchical partitioning. So when you have collinearity in a linear model, obviously it makes it hard to determine how much any one variable is having an effect compared to others because they sort of share variance and so on. Hierarchical partitioning is an approach of shuffling the order of the variables in the model. To make a long story short, also removing and adding them in. It's a bit of a iterative process to kind of estimate the relative influence of each variable. But there's a new approach to hierarchical partitioning in a new R package, which also helps deal with the sample size issue, because hierarchical partitioning is really limited by sample size. So you have a very limited amount of variables you can put in. But this new approach kind of helps with that by combining hierarchical partitioning and variance partitioning, and allows us to basically partition out each disturbance and or force change and look at the individual effect of that. And so that's making a very long story short, but I have to do that, unfortunately. So let's jump into some of the results. The results of hierarchical partitioning is basically to show the relative contribution to variance explained of each of these variables. So what we have in the area, the first question we're addressing is, does the time over which we quantify management activities matter? And the answer is yes, maybe not surprisingly. But to show it, what we have in the middle bar plots there, where there's a whole bunch of colors and then gray bar plots over top of them, that's showing the relative variance explained if we were to sum back 2 years in history of disturbances versus going back 5 years, going back 10 years, and 20 years. So right away, we see if we just summed everything that happened in 10 years, that's sort of the best variance explained. And so that's an interesting thing, but even probably more interesting, if we zoom in on the colored bars, which are the actual different disturbances, then we see that depending on the disturbance you're looking at, that the number of years over which the impact is greatest differs. And this probably, again, isn't surprising, but it's an important thing to consider that often isn't considered in these kind of studies. In this data set, what we see is clear cut has the greatest impact, greatest relative impact if we sum over 5 years, whereas planting has the greatest impact over 20 years, just as an example to compare those two. So for example, if we were just summing over 5 years, everything, we might say that the influence of planting is like half that of clear cut. But if we summed over 20, we might say they have an almost equal impact. So it's important to place temporal context of these things into your analyses. So what we've done then is now we've picked out, okay, we're going to look at planting over 20 years, clear cut in 5 years. Thinning, the greatest impact was 10, although really there isn't much difference no matter how often we, or over what time period we sum. Selection cut, 20 years, again, not much difference. The other important thing to note here is that it's important to place all of this interpretation in the context of what's happening on the landscape. You have to know the history of your management, because to a degree, like maybe it makes sense that planting has an impact after 20 years because it takes a long time for trees to grow on the landscape. But it also might just be because most of the planting activity happened 20 years ago. So it's really important to place this interpretation in the context of what you know about what's going on. So anyways, if we pull out these 4 disturbance years that we've honed in on here, 5 years for clear cut, 10 for thinning, 20 for planting and selection cut, And this is only telling us the relative influence of all these things. It doesn't tell us what it's actually doing to water chemistry. So we just looked at a correlation of all these things to water chemistry and a principal components analysis, because principal components is also fairly resistant to collinearity. We find basically 4 gradients of water chemistry, one being calcium and alkalinity. And that's maybe not surprising because calcium is largely influenced by the addition and removal of trees on the landscape and regulates alkalinity quite a bit. DOC concentration and micronutrients, DOC structure and DOC bound metals. These are things that all we expect to be moving together. And nitrogen and silica. Nitrogen and silica really drive algal development. So these are all things that are going to be influencing aquatic communities. And now looking at this, particularly the bar plots on the far right, we can start to answer the question of whether planting or post-harvest silviculture mitigates or accumulates effects. So in terms of effects on calcium, we're seeing it's moving in the same direction as clear cut and selection cut planting is. And there's no effective thinning. So basically there's an additional impact when you plant, and that makes sense for calcium. And I don't have time to go into all the details of why all this is, but it makes sense. In terms of the second sort of biggest gradient, DOC concentration of micronutrients, it's actually an opposite effect. And same for thinning, selection cut, and planting is all opposite of clear cut. So it's actually having a bit of a mitigative effect. And we see the same for the last two in terms of nitrogen and silica, it's mitigative, and in terms of DOC structure and metals, it's an additional impact. And again, we can see that over on the left-hand side, the overall impact of planting in 20 years versus clear cut in 5 years, it's smaller impact, but pretty comparable. So we are seeing a mitigative effect of some water chemistry impacts. Sorry, just before I move on, the other thing you might notice here is that the middle gray bars, which are showing a lot of the forest structure measurements, are showing some strong correlations to a lot of these things too. So let's revisit that in terms of what that means in terms of the variance partitioning. So to go back to the variance partitioning figure, basically what we're seeing here is that current forest structure explains more than any single disturbance in terms of variance, and possibly more than a lot of disturbances summed together as well. And that's actually paradigm shifting if you think about it in terms of how we manage forests with water in mind. We often manage forests to minimize the impacts of pulse disturbances. So things like sediment control measures, buffer strips, avoidance of soil disturbance. But what this is showing us is that forest structure that arises from the disturbances is just as big of an effect on water as the disturbances themselves. And this might be largely because we're doing a really good job of controlling disturbance effects. And what's left now is forest structure effects, but this also does open up new ways of thinking about how we manage our forests for the benefits to water. So what about natural variation? Well, that's what we've kind of captured here in the watershed variable. What that is basically all the other differences among the watersheds that we can't account for in terms of disturbances in forest structure and road impacts. And what we're seeing is that's pretty big. So what that tells us is that yes, our forest management practices are affecting water chemistry, but that all of these changes are less than or not dramatically more than natural ranges on the landscape. So we're doing a good job. So do we just stop there and say that's great? Well, we know that natural changes on the landscape are becoming more dramatic with climate changes. We also know that effects accumulate. So I would say that it's probably still a wise thing to continue to try to reduce management-related effects, especially since a lot of them are getting to the same magnitude, of natural variation on the landscape. So maybe it is worth considering managing, for target forest structures, for example, that might minimize impacts on water. So all I've talked about so far is water chemistry. Just very quickly, I'll touch on how that relates to ecosystem functions in streams. I don't have time. I need another 15 minutes to go into it in detail. But we've done a multivariate regression type approach in RDA to see how much all the water chemistry changes among the sites that we know are largely explained by forest management practices influence microbial communities that are carrying out ecosystem functions. And to make a long story short, we find that 63% of the variance in the communities is accounted for by these water chemistry changes. So that's big. We're only showing about half of that in this plot here. That's enough that we might expect to see functional differences within the community, but we have to actually, or we should also actually assess that directly because there is some functional redundancy in these communities. So we did that by looking at some enzymes highlighted in red here that are specifically produced by microbes to do certain things. So there's enzymes here that are involved in nutrient cycling. Again, to make a long story short, but what we're finding is, again, the water chemistry changes that we see in relation to forest management explain 50% or more of the variation in that as well. So it's a major effect, and it is enough. The water chemistry changes are enough to be influencing ecosystem functions in the streams. So to wrap up, does time over which we quantify management activities matter? Yes, it does. And maybe not surprisingly, different disturbances act in different timeframes. And it's important to place these results in the context of management history in the region when you're making conclusions about impacts. Does post-harvest silviculture exacerbate or mitigate effects? Well, it depends on what effects you're looking at. So this suggests that considerations of planting effects on water might actually need to be placed in the context of receding surface waters. In other words, you might want to consider what it is you're trying to mitigate in the water. And thirdly, is contemporary forest structure a good predictor of stream ecosystem conditions? Yes, it is. We found that the forest structure that's shaped by history of disturbances explains as much or more variation. And that is really sort of a shift in how we might think about managing forests in terms of protecting water resources. And that's it. Thanks.
I followed the crowd, and I also changed my title a little bit just because I've done this talk quite a few times, and the title can be quite lengthy. So I just thought of my role in the project and called my presentation "The Future of the Forest," looking at management and disturbance. And as Dave said, my name's Thomas Baglow, and I'm a master's student at UMB in the Faculty of Forestry, working under both Dave and Dr. Chris Henniger. So my role in the project, as I said, is to evaluate the future state of the forest across some of these different values that have been discussed and some other management objectives of the landowner, and to determine how planned forest management and natural disturbance will affect long-term management outcomes and objectives for those different indicators. And then assist in proposing some adaptation and mitigation strategies for any of those objectives where any issues are identified. And then one of the last steps, which is a big part of this project, is to help the company forest management planning staff in integrating some of the approaches I've developed into their planning processes. My study area, as everyone has discussed, is the Black Brook District. It's roughly 190,000 hectares. It's in quite a few papers. It would be cited as probably the most intensively managed forest in Canada, with a network of reserve areas, softwood plantations, and very high quality tolerant hardwood forests. And it's part of the Acadian Forest region in maritime Canada, so northwestern New Brunswick. And you can see the land base there. So this is some work from David Etheridge that looked at the forest back in 1945, and then when he was doing his work in 2002, and then he actually projected forward to 2025. But this is what the different stand types look like at different times in history. So it has been quite a dynamic forest over time. So the forest management and the ecology context of the property in question is there's, first of all, softwood plantations that are managed under a traditional plantation management regime with clear-cut, plant, spray, thin, and repeat on a maybe 40-year rotation. There's a tolerant hardwood portion of the forest, which is managed under selection and shelterwood harvesting systems. The main disturbance drivers that are present on the property that have been talked about are spruce budworm, which is a defoliator and causes both mortality and reduction in growth of trees. There's wind throw. So this is a picture actually from one of the operations foresters after a wind event, maybe, I'm not sure exactly what year, but 2013 or so. So that would be a plantation that had blown down. And then the other one, which I don't really have a picture to show it, but is climate change, if we can call that a disturbance, I suppose. But this is some research from Anthony Taylor, which shows the projected shifts in productivity of some of these different types of species on the landscape. So these are the different problems and things that the land manager is trying to deal with, and what I'm trying to address in some of my work. So the first part of my work was to look at all the different disturbance agents, as I kind of mentioned there previously, and figure out how I would integrate those into a traditional forest management planning model. And so that led me down the road of working on developing a risk map of wind throw for the land base. So I was given a training data set of all the blowdown areas that they've had. And this was to identify kind of intermediate scale wind throw events. So not like hurricane scale events, and not stand level tree blowdown. That's all kind of dealt with in different ways. But this was to deal with when 10, 20 hectare type areas blow down. So this was developed using a logistic regression model, and I could identify the different types of variables that I then had to use in my further modeling systems for the land base. So there were site variables, so depth to water table, the soil depth, soil bulk density. There were a variety of stand variables that were used in the final model. So a measure of slenderness, which was just essentially the average height divided by the quadratic mean diameter of any given portion of the forest, the height to crown base of the trees on average within a stand, percent spruce, and whether a stand was thinned or not, elevation, and winds. So this was the first half of my work that I worked on, and this was a major component in trying to project this type of a disturbance in my forest management planning model. And then for Spruce Budworm, there's already a long history of research in New Brunswick and Eastern Canada on that disturbance agent and how to account for that in forest management planning, going back to, I think, 1998 or 1999. But it essentially is called the Spruce Budworm Decision Support System. And by making some estimations about a defoliation levels or buildup of populations of spruce budworm, you can estimate the impact on your timber supply, essentially, or the growth of individual stands within your forest. And so that impacts stand level yield curves based on the defoliation scenario, as I said, and then it's built into local forest planning tools. So the growth and yield software, or the harvest scheduling software that's used. And then climate change. So this is still, to some extent, in progress on my part, but this influences, as we would expect, both stand productivity and regeneration patterns. So what comes back after a harvest or a disturbance, and the competitiveness of different species in the future. It influences disturbance regimes, and that synergism is a hard thing to estimate, but I'm just doing kind of a what if analysis in my modeling. So that's where I'm going with things. And there is some literature on expected increases in wind throw events that I will probably be drawing on some in my final work. But as of right now, there's generally, I would say, extreme uncertainty in being able to project some of these different issues. And then empirical versus process-based modeling. So I'm using an empirical growth and yield model, which I'm trying to do some augmentation with some process-based modeling, or that's in my plans to finish up my work. So the modeling system, as I roll together all of these different disturbances and the company's forest management plan, I developed a forest estate model in the same software that they use for their forest management planning. So that's Remsoft's Woodstock. So I use a spatial forest inventory, and I aggregated a plot database with some LiDAR metrics to come up with a spatially explicit plot inventory that I could then grow forward and aggregate into stands to put into a forest estate model. And that allows me to come up with the ability to project different forest management scenarios and come up with future projections of what the forest will look like and the values it'll provide into the future for some of these different indicators. And then, as I said, I use the Spruce Budworm decision support system to estimate 2 different spruce budworm scenarios. So that's a moderate and a severe outbreak scenario. This is under the assumption of failure of the early intervention system, which essentially ignoring that intervention that's currently ongoing. And then a wind throw probability and stochastic model. So this is exactly what I explained previously. I developed a risk model so I could predict the probability of any stand blowing down on the landscape in any 5-year period. And then the climate change scenario. So as of right now, I'm planning to just look forward for one climate change scenario, and this disturbance mechanism impacts the modeling framework in 2 ways, in both the stand growth model and the forest estate model, in impacting how stands grow and what grows after a harvest. So what the post disturbance trajectory of any given site is after a harvest. And then just looking at some of my results. So the first thing I look at is what the wood supply looks like from the land base, and this is one of the key variables that are used in the forest management planning model. So you can see on the left, I have a spruce budworm moderate and severe scenario, with the base scenario being the baseline essentially. So 100% of the originally planned target was met under that scenario. And then on the right-hand side, you see wind throw, a WT/moderate and WT/severe. So obviously, as I think we would all expect, something like a spruce budworm outbreak has a much more detrimental impact on spruce budworm timber supply than does wind throw, and wind throw has at some points where the harvest supply actually goes up, and that's primarily due to years of big simulated wind throw events that require salvage within the model. And then the same for hardwood. So you can see there's a bit of a growth effect of more area in the forest for hardwood trees to grow, and they take up the space, the previously occupied space of some of the spruce fir that was on the landscape and was then defoliated, and it provides the opportunity for a slight bump up in hardwood wood supply. And just looking over the 50-year projection horizon that I'm looking at, I'm projecting out further than that, but I'm summarizing results up to 2065. You can see the impact for spruce budworm moderate, severe, wind throw moderate and severe for both spruce fir, jack pine, and hardwood timber supply. The same goes for old forest area. So you can see old tolerant hardwood habitat, old softwood habitat, and old mixed wood habitat, and the proportion of the target that's met by the end of the 50-year projection horizon for each of the different scenarios. And so I have the same figures as I did for timber supply. So you can see it, instead of summarized over the 50-year time horizon, you can see it at the end of the 50-year time horizon, you can see it projected into the future, the different trends for the different habitat types. So the old forest habitat on the left due to the budworm scenario, and on the right due to the wind throw scenario. And then old tolerant hardwood habitat. So you can see again with spruce budworm on the left and wind throw on the right. So again, slightly as was expected, softwood forest was much more impacted by the spruce budworm scenario than it was by the wind throw scenario, but tolerant hardwood under the spruce budworm scenario, due to cutting pressure shifting on the landscape, it had a bit of an uptick in the actual meeting of the target over time. Some of the findings from this modeling work: some forest management objectives are more sensitive than others. So generally speaking, I would say that the old softwood habitat is the most sensitive not habitat, but stand type, that there's management objectives to maintain that on the landscape. It's quite a sensitive habitat, and I didn't have any of my climate change projections in there yet, but I would only hypothesize that habitat type as well will be most sensitive to climate change rather than the hardwood habitat. So generally speaking, the spruce fir and the softwood on both the wood supply and the habitat side is one of the more sensitive objectives on the land base that will be a challenge to continue to meet at current objectives. I'm currently working on the adaptation strategies for each disturbance mechanism to try and improve those results. So that is an ongoing process. But personally, I think that understanding of disturbance ecology and integrating that into mainstream forest management planning tools is a critical challenge to overcome, and an important part of the forest management planning process would be some sort of formal risk analysis as you come up with a management plan to see how sensitive some of these different objectives are, is probably a critical piece moving forward, especially. And then, as I said earlier, the synergisms between these disturbances is a challenge to quantify, and I'm still working on the different combinations of scenarios. So I've ran all of the different disturbance mechanisms by themselves, but I haven't completed all of the different combinations where you have wind throw and budworm and climate change all in one simulation. So that is the end of my presentation, and I can pass it on, Dave.
So I'm with JD Irving. I'm going to talk about kind of what all this research means to us, as forest managers and practitioners. You won't hear me talk about collinearity or hierarchical partitioning, but hopefully it'll be interesting nonetheless. So just a little bit about JD Irving first, quickly, and then Dave talked about the history of the frac work, so I'll touch on that quickly as well, and then get into what are we doing with all this, and what are we getting out of it, which is really sort of the heart of a lot of this work. So, and a little bit of a look ahead. So who are we? We're privately owned, integrated forest products company. We have land holdings and lands under management in the state of Maine, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. So we are in the east, and we produce a set of products, valued forest products, from lumber through to pulp and paper products, tissue products, corrugated medium, and it's all housed within our integrated business. And we're kind of a seed to shelf organization, and so we do a lot of work across the piece on everything from tree genetics through to ecology research, and kind of everything in between. So why is this important to us? Well, we're ultimately trying to balance a set of objectives as a landowner, as a forest products company. Obviously one of our primary objectives is to remain competitive over time. We compete globally, so obviously the sustainability of the business economically is important to us, and the sustainability of our land is also equally important. So we want to do good forestry and manage for generations to come. So we tend to think of ourselves as in long-term thinkers of forest management. We think in terms of generations, not quarters. That's kind of who we are. So it allows us to look ahead quite a ways and try to understand what our forest management is doing as far as contributions to those objectives. And then another one of our goals we're always trying to meet is try to be a good neighbor, support our communities, and have meaningful engagement with our stakeholders, and ultimately be a good employer as well. And I think what underpins some of our thinking on how to balance all these objectives is that we believe that when it's done right, intensification and conservation go hand in hand, and they're not in conflict. But the requirement to achieve that means that you have to be really good at both of those, both intensification and conservation. So when we think of conservation work and managing the forest sustainably, for us, it's really comes down to, I would say, a mindset of continuous improvement and adaptive forest management. And I think the science and the research that we're talking about here today is the fuel for that continuous improvement and adaptive forestry cycle. And a lot of that, has really been spawned from the work that's going on here and has gone on in the past. So we're, we've been at this for a while as far as, the research side and adaptive forestry, and trying to figure out how to integrate the learnings from research into our practices. It's not easy, but we believe that is the, one of the keys to be good at this, this model of intensification meets conservation. And we're committed to having our work third-party verified through our Sustainable Forestry Initiative certification and FSC as well. So it's been almost 25 years of work doing the research. A lot of it started through that certification efforts around identifying a research committee, identifying priorities, and committing to the work through time, because it's a long game. A lot of projects, a lot of years, 40 graduate students, postdocs, over 80 publications, and a lot of involvement from our folks, our staff, who are quite engaged in the process, trying to help bring value, I guess, to not only to the framing up the questions, but carrying out the research as well. So what is the goal, I guess, for us is, as I mentioned, we think to meet our balance of objectives and do this part of our work well, we need good knowledge ultimately, and that comes through a continuous supply of research findings. And so where do they show up? Where does the work show up? Well, there's some of the work which we just saw around long range thinking, kind of looking out further ahead into the future. And there's also, today there's applications of research findings that help us adjust quickly and understand how to make better best practices, policies, and some examples of that are, we have a program where early on we identified the need to maintain older forest communities through time, and they were identified as classes, forest communities that were relevant and on the landscape, historically, and how do we maintain those old classes through time. So we have an internal policy to maintain 10% of those communities. That doesn't mean the other forest is not doing anything. So that's obviously what you see in some of this research is what is the other forest doing in addition to this 10% of old forests that we maintain. So what are the intensively managed areas like plantations contributing to ecological services? And then ultimately, the research portfolio touches other areas like, some of the mapping we do, the LiDAR work, the site soil classification. How do you integrate these tools, these findings, these learnings into our practices and into our modeling and our forecasting work. And ultimately, there's a lot of integration across between technology and some of our traditional wildlife and ecology research, as you could see in some of the projects that are leveraging some of that research, some of the technology in the research. And I think probably just as important as the well-structured questions and projects that are driven from the land manager, questions that are relevant to our foresters, concerns that our folks are thinking about on a regular basis, is so that contribution, that focus and prioritization that happens in sort of our research program. I think just as important to that is the development of collaborations and being successful at collaborations, which is kind of the one of the harder efforts, I think, in all of this. Not because it's not because it's hard to collaborate. It's just there's a lot of time and commitment and time in the field, and a lot of work trying to bridge between science and practitioners. And I think that's what I would say has probably been one of the better successes of the FRAC, is the commitment from researchers to come over to the world of practical forest managers, and the commitment from the forest managers to understand and really dig into the science and figure out what it's telling us, and then ask the critical questions and try to learn. So that's been a very healthy exchange over the years. It's really helped us get better, and it's a commitment on both sides that's been a great model, I think, across the country for long-standing collaborations. I think as we look ahead, this is going to be increasingly important. How do we successfully collaborate? We're in the process of designing our next stage of research questions and trying to summarize what we've learned so far, so that we can figure out where and how to integrate. So looking ahead, we're working closely with the research community to identify top priorities, important questions, and then how to organize them into the next 5-year research program, which we're committed to seeing through. So some of the current topics, challenges, questions, we're always trying to, as forest managers, work at the landscape level. So that that's always the part where moving from small scale to large scale applications is where it becomes real for us, and we can start to see across landscapes more integration of some of the models we saw, some of the outputs we saw of the various ecological research, whether it be birds, beetles, bryophytes, water, into our management systems. What is the role of climate change and all of the above, and so on. So we have a great base. We've learned a lot. We have a strong foundation to go into the next round of research. It takes a lot of refinement, so that's kind of where we are today, is how do we get these questions down to something meaningful, where we know we're going to get a useful outcome and some good insight. So just to wrap up, it's been, from the company's perspective, this has been a huge success for us, and very important work for us, as there's a lot of pressure on the land everywhere, right? There's more people in the world, and there's the same amount of land. So we have the job to figure out how to how to operate and manage forests in a way that they can provide products and services to people, but also to nature. And it's as I said in the beginning, the fuel for doing that well is going to be a continuous commitment to learning and adapting. And this is truly has been a very good model for us. And we appreciate all the work that happens on the FRAC and look forward to some of the next steps. Thank you.